Hi guys, welcome back. This is Fei.
This is Nick.
And this is Creogs over coffee.
Okay, so today on the podcast, we have back with us once more the irreplaceable Luke Burns. No relation to me, but just as a reminder, Luke graduated from OBGYN residency at the University of Michigan in 2022. He was a hospitalist there for a year before moving to the University of Chicago in Endeavor Health, where he's now a first-year MFM fellow. Luke, welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me back on Creogs over coffee. I really had such a blast last time we talked together on that episode about hypertension and pregnancy. So I'm really glad to have been invited back on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think as I shared with you the last time that you were on, I'm loving sort of the history buff take that you go for. And I'm hopeful that we're going to jump into some of the same stuff today. So just before I even share anything, what are we going to tackle?
I love the history stuff too, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. So I wanted to do another episode that kind of investigated something that we as trainees take for granted in pregnancy, under that same theme that we did last time I was on, which was why we do the things the way we do in obstetrics.
I love it. So, or what are we going to learn about in terms of what we do? I'm
going to be tackling a pretty big topic today. It's the labor curve. That means our learning objectives today will be something like, first, we'll review how we classify those different time points in labor. Next, we'll understand the origins of that so-called Friedman curve and how it influenced how we managed labor kind of throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. And finally, we're going to try to understand the weaknesses of the Friedman curve and to understand some of the proposed replacements for understanding the natural course of labor. And now I'll start by saying one thing that really makes me laugh when we are all teaching residents and medical students is just how many different arbitrary time points we've assigned in labor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love actually the fact that you're going for this because I feel the exact same when I talk about this. We got 2 phases of labor, but 3 stages. Not to mention labor tracings that come in 3 categories, at least here in the US, 3 different types of fetal heart rate decelerations, 7 cardinal movements of labor. What is this numeric soup we've gotten ourselves into?
Yeah, we love to just assign numbers to things. It's a wonder that any of us actually managed to pass our shelf exams in the first place, just because of all these different categorizations that we had to memorize. I certainly sympathize with all the medical students who might be listening. Today, though, let's just focus on 2 different phases of labor, what we call the active and the latent phase. Now, it's been a while since I was in medical school and took my shelf exams, Nick, so maybe you could give me a refresher on just how we define these phases of labor.
Yeah, Luke. So the first stage of labor, the time when cervical dilation is taking place, we've talked about on the show before and splits into 2 phases. The quote unquote latent phase that occurs when the cervix is dilated to less than 6 centimeters, and then the active phase when the cervix gets to 6 centimeters or greater.
Right. Thanks for refreshing my memory. So to understand why we even assigned phases to labor in the first place, we have to go way, way back to a guy called Emanuel Friedman, who was an obstetrician who was practicing at Columbia University in New York City in the 1950s.
Sounds like the guy who invented Friedman's curve.
Right on it. So Dr. Friedman was born in Brooklyn. He graduated from Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in 1957. And it was there in the 50s that he met Dr. Virginia Apgar. That's another name that might sound familiar to your listeners.
Yeah, that obstetrical celebrities. You're naming them all.
Right. And Dr. Virginia Apgar, she kind of deserves an episode all to herself. By 1938, when she was the director of the Division of Anesthesiology at Columbia University, which was an incredible feat for a time when women struggled just to be allowed to attend medical school, let alone to be hospital directors of their entire unit.
Yeah, and for New York City bar trivia, I guess, she was also the first woman at Columbia to become a full professor. But you mentioned that she met Friedman. So what does she have to do exactly with Friedman, though?
Well, right, in the 1940s, Dr. Apgar was appalled that so little effort was being placed on resuscitating infants who some of the staff had deemed too apneic or too small to survive following childbirth. And so this was an era of a time that we kind of called, or a practice that we called twilight sleep, you may have heard of before, when laboring patients were administered these huge amounts of narcotics to assist with the labor pain. Instead of epidurals, they were given kind of massive doses of morphine, up to 40 to 50 milligrams at a time.
Wow, that's snowing moms, and I can't imagine be very good for the neonates in the end.
Right, exactly. And that's exactly what Dr. Apgar thought. She realized that these infants that were being born to these mothers exposed to these whopping amounts of anesthetic agents were becoming really hypoxic at birth. But this was a time when there was no real consistent quantitative measure of neonatal hypoxia that actually already existed. So neuraxial analgesia was becoming more available in the US kind of in the 1940s, but many doctors were still relying on these big doses of morphine and other agents.
So I have to think that in order to prove then that neuraxial analgesia would lead to better neonatal outcomes, Dr. Apgar first needed to prove that the high doses of morphine led to neonatal hypoxia. And perhaps in order to do that, she ultimately created the world's first neonatal hypoxia scoring system.
That's exactly right. And so that's how Dr. Apgar ended up inventing the Apgar scoring system, which is what we still use today.
Yeah, and in the process, Dr. Apgar saved millions of lives.
She certainly did. And I think Apgar is also really interesting in that it's an excellent example of a backronym. So the word Apgar, as in the person's name, Dr. Apgar, that came first. And a decade after the guidelines were published, some physicians adapted the criteria that she had established to fit the word Apgar. It's kind of, I can't think of any other backronyms that I've ever come across, but that's kind of an interesting, maybe some more of your New York City trivia for those pub crawls you've been doing. Anyway, Dr. Apgar began to popularize caudal anesthesia, and she next wanted to understand the effect of neuraxial analgesia on the labor process itself. So for this, she turned to Dr. Friedman, who was just a resident at the time. But when Dr. Apgar kind of asked the general pool of physicians present, including Dr. Friedman, she wanted to know how she might quantify the effects of an epidural on labor. And Dr. Friedman realized that actually there was very little objective information published about the actual progress of labor.
That's kind of wild that the story starts when he's a resident. And also to have the insight to decide to start monitoring the labor curves of patients at that point, I guess.
Yeah, I know. It makes me feel like what was I doing when I was a resident? Probably just trying to, get home so I could sleep. But that's kind of what he was going to do. I mean, he had this in mind, at least, that he wanted to collect some data on these patients. But what ended up actually happening was, well, at least the story goes, that he was on call one night at the Columbia University, and his wife went into labor at a completely different hospital. And he asked his superior if he could go and leave the hospital to attend the birth of his first child. But kind of surprise, surprise, the resident wasn't allowed to leave. He was denied that request. So instead of going to the actual hospital, he just called his wife's hospital every hour for an update on her labor course. And then he had a paper and a pencil, and he plotted the results of her cervical dilation, her effacement, her contractions, all on a graph. And the result that formed was this famous S-shaped curve, which is defined by an initial slow rate of change in cervical dilation at the outset of labor. That's what we call the so-called latent phase. Then an inflection point characterized by sudden rapid change in cervical dilation. That's the active phase. And then a slowing of cervical dilation, what he called the deceleration phase.
That is a fascinating story. And thankfully, I have my headphones in, because I think if my wife heard that and tried to think of me doing the same thing, she might kill me right here and now. So I have to know, though, did he end up making it to his child's birth?
Yep, thankfully, he made it to his child's birth.
Oh, thank God, because again, we may not have the Friedman curve otherwise, I guess. But anyways, so Dr. Friedman, kind of, if folks have seen the paper or have heard of this before, they may recall the landmark study that was published ultimately in 1955. But I think kind of the question that comes to the modern trainee may be one of, well, we don't really use this Friedman curve today, so why don't we use the Friedman curve?
Yeah, you're totally right, Nick. And I think we've all heard of the Friedman curve. We know it's been influential, but we don't actually use it explicitly. And the main reason is there's just a ton of problems with the studies that Friedman used. First of all, of the 500 women in his biggest kind of initial study, none were women of color. This was a time when most hospitals in the US were still completely segregated by race. And then secondly, another big problem was birthing practices at that time were completely different than they are now. In fact, half of the women in his study, if you look at the actual data, were delivered by forceps, including mid forceps, which we definitely don't do anymore. And then less than 2% of the deliveries in his cohort had cesarean deliveries compared to, more like a third of patients these days. Additionally, more than 70% of the patients had either moderate to deep sedation, and less than 15% of the patients received Pitocin. And finally, and this is going to sound really hard to believe, but until the late 1950s, many of the assessments of the cervix that he and his colleagues were making were actually made transrectally.
I can't imagine being a poor intern learning to assess cervical dilation and having to do it, not only just figuring out where the cervix is, but having to do that through the rectum.
Again, I think we have little to complain about. Maybe things are a little bit better than they used to be. But anyway, despite his faults, the Friedman curve was our first example of what we now call a partogram or a partograph, which is a graphical representation of the kind of anticipated labor curve. It really was super appealing to physicians at the time because before Friedman came up with it, no one had really tried to organize all the complex, unpredictable qualities of labor into a kind of a quantifiable graphical form. And Friedman actually described 4 phases of labor: a latent phase, an acceleration phase, phase of constant maximal dilation, and then a deceleration phase. And for him, the period of most rapid cervical change started at around 3 to 4 centimeters.
Yeah, this is definitely familiar. I mean, I remember probably while I was transitioning through as a resident, actually, people were wearing buttons or saying things like 6 is the new 4, or reading some textbooks that said, the active phase began at 4 centimeters. And I guess that just kind of shows how influential Dr. Friedman and this curve really were, even despite some of these issues you've pointed out.
Exactly. But what Friedman really helped draw our attention toward was understanding kind of the difference between normal and abnormal labor. He also came back to Dr. Apgar later on after her initial kind of challenge and told her that, in fact, no, according to his study, epidurals did not affect the length of the labor course in his patients.
All right, so I'm going to move us forward from the Friedman curve for a second. Though you've given us kind of this really interesting historic data to reflect upon. Because really, I think most trainees today, and when they hear about the Friedman curve, they probably also hear it in the same breath as the Zhang curve of labor too.
Exactly. So Dr. Jun Zhang was with an NIH when he started first kind of noticing that the Friedman's curve didn't really reflect normal labor courses. So the rate of change in cervical dilation was way more variable, and normal labor was typically a lot slower than Friedman had been suggesting with his curves from the 1950s. So Dr. Zhang and his colleagues collected data on more than 1,100 nulliparous patients, but instead of forcing the cervical dilation data to kind of fit a rigid curve of best fit, he just modeled a new curve and then tested it statistically to find the most robust fit that fit all the data he had. And then in Dr. Zhang's curve, labor looked very different than it did for Friedman.
I have to imagine too, that makes sense in a lot of ways, where the Friedman's patients he was seeing in New York in the 50s and 60s were probably very different than Dr. Zhang's 21st century patients.
That's a really good point. And in fact, Dr. Zhang and his team actually addressed that. They did something pretty clever. They actually went back and they found Dr. Friedman's original patient population, and they applied Dr. Zhang's mathematical models to Friedman's data from the 1950s and the 1960s. And they found that even though they were using this kind of antiquated data from a time when labor was practiced very differently, the curve still looked completely different from what Friedman had proposed based on his data. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it turned out that the mathematical techniques that the different researchers have been using, Friedman versus curve, the different mathematical techniques actually determine the line of best fit were actually super important to how the labor curve ended up looking rather than the data itself.
That's super fascinating. So in the end, what did Zhang and his team discover about that?
Well, Friedman had said that dilation from 4 to 10 centimeters only took, 2.5 hours, which probably sounds a little bit unrealistic to us these days. Zhang found it was more like 5.5 hours. He found that making no significant cervical change for 2 hours before 6 to 7 centimeters was actually kind of totally normal, and it wasn't really an aberrant representation of labor. And so the active phase, therefore, definitely couldn't start until at least 6 centimeters. And finally, Zhang also found that there was no such thing as a deceleration phase.
So, I mean, you said Dr. Zhang used new math, rigid techniques. Is it kind of easy to follow then the Dr. Zhang curve has to be superior to the older Dr. Friedman curve?
It's really hard to say, as everything always is in obstetrics. I wish I had a really easy answer for that question. But what I can tell you is that in 2017, a Norwegian study tried to kind of answer that exact specific question. Is Zhang's curve entirely superior to Friedman's curve? So researchers designed a randomized control trial in which 3,900 laboring women were managed according to Zhang's guidelines and 3,300 according to the World Health Organization guidelines, which basically use a variation of Friedman's curve.
What happened with that study?
The cesarean delivery rates and maternal and neonatal outcomes were similar in both groups. But the cesarean delivery rates fell in both groups, which basically demonstrated that a focus on labor management can lower cesarean delivery rates irrespective of whatever labor curve you use to manage those labors.
And I'm just being a pessimist here, perhaps this just demonstrates kind of the Hawthorne effect, right? If you're being observed, we modify our behavior. And so by being held to a curve, we hold our behavior to the curve. But anyways, I'm going to leave that behind. But I'll just say kind of in your estimation, Luke, where does this leave us today?
Well, in 2014, ACOG embraced Zhang's curve, and they published something that I think a lot of your listeners will be familiar with, which is the safe prevention of the primary cesarean delivery. I remember a resident printing that out for me when I was a second-year medical student. I don't have the original copy, but I certainly refer to it over and over again. So that publication defined arrest disorders, and it defined the active phase of labor. And this is probably what is most familiar with your listeners and how many of them still diagnose arrest disorders in labor.
Sure. And then I guess, it would follow then that since Dr. Zhang published his data, part of this, again, we said was like we're holding ourselves to the curve, observing it. Perhaps the rate of unindicated cesarean delivery has gone down in the wake of the Zhang curve. Is that fair to say?
Not exactly. Cesarean delivery rates seem to have continued to rise, even with relatively permissive guidelines that were published from ACOG based on Dr. Zhang's labor curves. So back in February of this year, there was a paper that was published in the Gray Journal that argued that using the passage of time as the only factor that defines an arrest disorder is inaccurate and overly simplistic. Instead, the authors of the study used AI machine learning to take into account multiple factors at once to generate an individual labor curve for each laboring patient. So that meant that dilation curves were generated based on the average number of contractions over 10 minutes, the duration of unchanged exam time, the use of epidural, and tons of other factors.
So the Dr. Claude or Dr. ChatGPT curve is right around the corner, I have to imagine.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be named after somebody. And if it's Dr. Nick Burns and he names it after himself, then I might just start telling medical students that it was named after Dr. Luke Burns instead.
I think there's a better chance of it being the Dr. Luke Burns curve, but this has been super fascinating, Luke. And I really appreciate, again, another deep dive into this topic with probably a lot more history than we realize. And again, sort of for folks listening who say, gosh, we practice this way or we do it that way, perhaps a little bit of insight into why we do that. Thanks again.
Yeah, it was such a joy to be on the show again. I'm glad we got to learn something really interesting together. Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of this episode. So once again, this is Fei.
This is Nick.
And this is Creogs Over Coffee.
So guys, if you enjoyed the podcast, head over to iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, whatever your podcatcher is. Give us a 5-star rating and review.
You can find us on social media on X at CreogsOverCoff1, on Facebook and Instagram at CreogsOverCoffee. And if you want to donate to the show, go ahead and go over to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/CreogsOverCoffee.
You can find show notes for this episode and all of our previous episodes on our website, CreogsOverCoffee.com.
And if you want to reach out to us, have a question about the show, have ideas for an episode or a correction for us, go ahead and email us, CreogsOverCoffee@gmail.com.